Hello, I'm Rick Pena with Worldwide Technology, and we are at the Worldwide Technology DC Innovation Center in the heart of our nation's capital. We're hosting with Cisco today some governors and other political leaders, and because of that, we have executives from both companies. So I'm pleased to be with Sean Rodriguez and Gary DiPreta today. And before I ask you both some questions, how about you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do? We'll start with you, Gary.
Thanks, Rick. Gary DiPreta. I lead Cisco's state, local government, and education business, both K through 12 and higher ed across the U.S. And I've been partnered with this guy for a lot of years.
Yeah. And you, Sean?
Much like Gary, Sean Rodriguez, have the pleasure of leading the state and local government and education team at Worldwide Technology.
And I have the pleasure of knowing you both personally, and I know how awesome you are. So we're going to talk about digital transformation first. So going back to the beginning of the pandemic, obviously there were some factors that accelerated the digital transformation in some of our state and local governments. And that led to an experience change for the constituents and how they receive services and interact with the government. Can you talk to some of the trends? How about we'll start with you first, Gary. Talk to some of the trends that you see in digital transformation, what's driving it, and maybe some outcomes that you see as a result of it.
Yeah, and sure, you hit it on the head. It accelerated during the pandemic because, as we all know, Rick, like the consumer experience, I mean, this started before the pandemic, right? You can order anything from your app on your iPhone, especially for younger generations. So the government, state, local governments that Sean and I cover, were already starting that journey, but the pandemic accelerated that. And so, the old days of having to visit a government office to go get something done, whether it's licensing or permitting, I mean, those days are gone. There's certain things that will always remain there, but consumerization has happened. So, one of the things, as an example, that we saw was, if you take the city of Buffalo, for example, during the pandemic, they needed to modernize their call center, but not just from a technology perspective. To your point, the agents had to be pushed out into a remote environment because they couldn't come in. So that kind of created an opportunity to modernize the call center. And in that modernization, they introduced automation tools like bots, right, to deliver sort of citizen services. Those call centers were overwhelmed during the pandemic, so there had to be a modernization of automation tools. It created a real big opportunity to change and improve the experience that citizens had with their call centers, and that's their front line of defense, right, or opportunity to engaging with citizens. So we saw as one example, but the journey also forced a second set of issues, which is the underlying infrastructure wasn't ready for all of this modernization, and so there was a lot of technical debt within our state, local governments, and so what we've had to do is take a step back with our government agencies. Coming out of the pandemic and sort of understand that vision of modernization, where we wanted to take those digital services and citizen services. That vision becomes a roadmap, that roadmap becomes an architecture, and that's of course what Cisco and WWT quite well. And of course we want to secure all of this too. So in that architecture we want to make sure it's secure.
Yeah, I have a question on security that's coming up next.
Great.
So your perspective, Sean, same question.
Yeah, I think Gary did a great job of capturing that. I think expanding upon that, I looked at it kind of in two different ways, right? The Optimus Infinity, it accelerated the art of the possible, and it also exposed tech debt, but exposed tech debt in a positive way that finally was able to make our IT stakeholders within the government organizations we serve get the attention of the policymakers and those on Capitol Hill that provide the funding. And so when you kind of think about that, that certainly drove the opportunity for our customers, as Gary mentioned, to look at infrastructure modernization, but also to look at things like application modernization, right? And also, again, in going and how they're interacting, exposing some of the generational expectations. So, for example, there are governments who have since stood up or even had portals for how, as a single doorway into government, how their citizens may interact. Well, during the pandemic, you had a lot of folks, especially in underserved, underprivileged communities, there isn't a laptop with a portal. They were wanting to access those services through their cell phone, through their smartphone. So the acceleration of the digital platform for digital transformation, and really, again, the underlying application modernization and the things that are required to make that tick. some really good examples of things that we saw during the pandemic as a result. We worked, for example, with Cisco very closely on a couple of projects with what we called virtual state houses. Normally when a legislative session kicks in, it's very important. People love to go to Capitol Hill. They like to see it. All the delegates or representatives or senators are there. Well, that wasn't necessarily possible. So now we've helped them design and build these virtual state houses, which as a result has allowed citizens and constituents to plug in to that process more so than ever before. I also think, I'll wrap with saying, looking at how the COVID pandemic was just that, it was a natural disaster, right? It was emergency management at its core. And since then, we've seen some great examples where the lessons learned there have really accelerated and minimized the impact of such events. For example, Hurricane Ian that took place towards the end of last year and devastated South Florida, within matters of days, and they had services, temporary services restored. There were portals brought up so that you could go put a name in if you were looking for somebody, or put a name in if you found somebody, finding emergency housing, emergency food sources. These are things that took weeks, if ever, to develop prior to us learning the lessons we did from digital transformation from the pandemic.
Absolutely. Both answers very comprehensive, and they both kind of hinted on something you said earlier, Gary, about security. So I'm going to start with you, Sean, on this question. So the question really is around cybersecurity. That being the case, right, the expectations of the constituents and the citizens have changed. They are seeking to receive their services in a different way. Obviously, the pandemic really forced or drove or accelerated hybrid work. All of these things have changed. For those of us that are in the network provider space, we realize that the cybersecurity framework has changed, right? So that being the case, how can we provide all of these services and meet the expectations while at the same time remaining secure end to end? You first, Sean.
Yes, Rick, very much so. Obviously, security's been present in everything we do for quite some time, but never accelerated to the point to where it has now. And we like to think about it as, security is not a thing, it's everything. It's organic in everything that's out there from a technology or a digital perspective. And so thinking about it, oftentimes with some of the stakeholders on my team and the conversations we're having with customers, we really try to kind of think about it or break it down into three areas, right? Having a position or policy, funding, and then the operational aspect of things. And what we found that, believe it or not, cybersecurity can be a scary thing, but citizens and constituents and employees, they kind of like that level of confidence that it instills that actually their government organizations are taking a position, they're developing a policy. And when that policy's been developed, that kind of leads to the next stage, which it gives them kind of the clarity and the ammunition they need to go get the funding to do this. If there's one thing that we've seen a dramatic change on in the past couple of years, it's acceleration of funding for cybersecurity. There are states now putting tens of millions of dollars of increases year over year into what they're putting into their cybersecurity plan. And then also, obviously, the federal money that we've seen come into the state and local communities through IIJA and some of the federal funding acts and processes out there. But at the same time, that money doesn't do any good if you don't have an operational plan, right? And I do think when we look at it and say, there are things like, obviously, NIST and zero trust architecture and frameworks out there that people are finally adapting and adopting. And whether it's by the carrot, by the stick, or a little bit of both, we are starting to see those operational plans come together with more confidence and more clarity. But the last thing I'll say on that is, there still is a talent gap. There's over 750,000 open cybersecurity jobs in this country as we speak right now. So within that operational plan, not only the funding piece of it, the architectural piece of it, sustaining it, but how you're going to man that, how you're going to operate that on an hour-to-hour and day-to-day basis, 24/7, 365, has to be a foundational part of that plan.
Oh, absolutely. That was a very comprehensive answer as well. But now, from a Cisco perspective, those of us that know Cisco, like myself, know that Cisco has been providing the networks for years, but now security is absolutely, germane to everything that you have to do from a network provider perspective. So your perspective, Gary, same question.
Yeah, I think there's four key areas that I've been engaging at the state local education level. So first one we kind of already talked about, Rick. I know it seems mundane, but that technical debt when you have code in your infrastructure software that is no longer supported or covered, that is a cybersecurity exposure point. And to Sean's point, government leaders, IT leaders know that. that. They've been using that to go back to legislation to get funding, and clearly, our governments recognize the importance of it, both at a state level, federal level. So they're using that to solve that technical debt, to certainly modernize, but also to kind of lock down some of the cybersecurity exposures. So that's sort of the first area we've seen, which is pretty much table stakes. The next area, Sean talked about it, right, which is having an architecture, and that's what Cisco and WWT does really well. But I think the journey for my engagement over the past several years, because you've known Cisco for a lot of years, is when I bring up cyber and Cisco in front of a government leader, they go, oh, we use your firewalls. And we all know that the world has changed architecturally for security, and why Cisco has purchased companies like Duo, Umbrella, AMP, because identity is the new perimeter, right? You have to lock down that sort of edge. And so, security is much more robust just than a network firewall these days. And we see the states, from a trend over the past 90 days, just locking down with executive orders. And it's appropriate on this day where we're hosting governors here at the Politico event for locking down social media apps that they have to be compliant on. Well, you're not going to do that through firewall. You're going to do that through endpoint security, which if you have an architecture and you have the right solutions, we can engage there. The third one is around kind of what is happening with the federal government. So the federal government through DHS CISA is coming out through IIJ funding, the cybersecurity grant funding. And what's more important than the dollars is really the intent for the Department of Homeland Security. And what they want the states to do at the state level is to really take a more active role in the local municipalities. Now, here in the state of Maryland, Annapolis, the state CISO is not going to help Montgomery County or the city of Baltimore, who have robust cybersecurity programs, but the other several hundred, if not a couple thousand, smaller municipalities need that expertise and that help. So I think that's going to be a trend where the state CISOs are going to be encouraged through funding and what DHS wants us to do to sort of lean in on that cyber strategy. And then finally, Sean spoke about it, but we have a workforce development issue in this country for cybersecurity. So things like our networking academies, which Rick, in your career, is a robust corporate social responsibility program. We've been taking that and working with government leaders to create a pipeline talent. Networking academies isn't just for networking anymore. It's a cybersecurity track, a networking track, developers track. So it's much more robust than the three of us were in our younger days. So those are the four areas that I've been partnering with government on.
So Gary, network connectivity is foundational to Cisco. Yeah. And we're talking about connectivity in the United States now. So I came across a term recently that took me aback a little bit because I'm involved in several diversity, equity, and inclusion discussions. But there was a discussion around digital inclusion and the digital divide that we have in the United States. So now, more than ever, connectivity to the internet, network connectivity, is almost like a basic need. We're saying that for Americans is like food and shelter, like oil and gas, that type of thing. So if that's a basic need for governments, local governments, to provide services to the constituents, there has to be some type of connectivity to send and receive those services. Then what are we doing to bridge the gap from the digital divide so that there is digital inclusion? So I know Cisco is very involved in that. What are we doing, and what are some of the areas where we still need work?
Yeah, it's an awesome topic. One of the unfortunate things that the pandemic exposed was, especially for our nation's children, was when we pushed everybody virtually, it was great to have content and the ability for teachers and faculty to teach, but it exposed what you said, right? We had an awful lot of students, millions and millions of families who didn't have access or affordability, or candidly, there just wasn't any high-speed experiences available to them. And so, thankfully, in this nation, it's a bipartisan issue, which there aren't many in this country today. The federal government has stepped up with IIJ funding, to the tune of about $65 billion, and then other states are adding on. For instance, Governor Newsom's coming in with another $6.5 billion on top of that to help solve this issue. As you know, Rick, it's super, passionate for. It's a passion for Cisco. In fact, our vision statement is powering an inclusive future for all. It's a personal platform, as Sean knows, as I travel the coast to coast on a weekly basis. I spend a lot of time talking about this topic, and here's some few things that I've seen from state to state, the way we're going to go about solving it. So the first thing we're going to have to do is solve, this fiber issue. We've got to put fiber in the ground, right? What's called the middle mile, which is these state networks. And if it was going to be a private sector-led initiative, we would have already solved it. But the economics aren't there to, drive broadband to the rural parts of these states or even sort of inner city. So the economics don't work, and that's why the government is stepping in. And I see most states, whether they're red state or blue state, building out a middle mile, and that's going to take some time. That last mile connecting, sort of those points of presence to the neighborhoods, that's going to take some time, and that's going to be very private sector oriented, obviously, to help scale and keep economic sustainability of the model. But I see different models even on that last mile. State of California is doing something really interesting where they're looking to use it as an economic development opportunity, let's say for the city of LA, and encouraging small businesses to help solve that last mile versus maybe some other states go to the traditional service provider. So I think it's an exciting time to solve that in different ways. And then finally, what Cisco's been involved in, and I think of the city of Fort Worth as an example, is that's going to take several years to kind of solve the build out of the middle mile, build out of the last mile. And we see educators and mayors really leaning in because while it's not simply an issue for our kids, I meet with government leaders and they talked about stories during the pandemic where 8, 9-year-olds are on the school steps or library steps till 9 o'clock at night doing homework because they have no access. So the educators are on the front lines of solving this issue. So that there's a bridge plan where we used in the city of Fort Worth, partnering with with the mayor and the CIO down there, but taking our ultra reliable wireless broadband, shooting high speed into 5 underserved neighborhoods with 60,000 residents, and deploying 802.11 Wi-Fi on utility poles. So we also see a stopgap solution for the next several years that cities are deploying. But no, we're really proud of the work that we're doing there, and we're also proud it bleeds into the work we're doing at HBCUs. As you know, we're pretty committed to the HBCUs, which, by the way, 82% of the HBCUs in this country are in a broadband desert. So there's not even access to high-speed broadband, and they can become anchor points into the communities they serve. So we're pretty proud of the work we're doing with the HBCUs as well.
Well, as someone who was born and raised in one of those underserved communities, I want to thank you. I definitely appreciate the work that you're doing personally, Gary, and also Cisco Systems. So now last question to be for you, Sean, and it's going to be around the workforce. You mentioned the workforce a few minutes ago. With everything changing, with digital transformation being what it is, it's becoming harder and harder to recruit and retain the best talent. So what are some of the things that leaders can do out there to hire and retain the best talent?
Yeah, Rick, it's a great question. I at least feel perhaps more than any other issue, this is the most difficult one to solve. If you look at, for example, the priorities that we see develop out of the CIO communities, whether it be at the state government level, the local government level, the higher education level, you will consistently see cybersecurity as the number one challenge, and then everything else kind of moves around below that. But workforce and the challenges associated with that have consistently moved up the ranks to among the top 3 priorities within the government and education sector now. And it's not going to be solved. Public-private partnerships, as an example, are something that's been very successful in our space over the past few years. But it goes beyond that. It's not just going to be a public-private solution. You're going to have public-private. You're going to have private-private. You're going to have public-public. And there's examples we see of all of this out there. As an example, first of all, there are opportunities for leveraging companies such as Worldwide Technology and our peer community out there for strategic staffing. Certainly it's a big focus for us. It's a big growth area because we do bring that bench strength, that built in, ready to go. And so there's an immediate time to productivity or return on investment for those customers. But beyond that, some of the real interesting things we're seeing out there, the idea that someone's a 20, 25, 30-year state employee anymore, those days are kind of gone. I think we've moved beyond that. So I think governments are starting to live in the realization that, hey, if you can get somebody for a couple, 3, maybe 5 years, you've probably done well, and that's kind of the operating mode you need to be in. So we know states, for example, that are working with universities for paid internships, right? You've got these junior and senior level, very smart young adults out there, and they're ready to come in and make a contribution. And beyond that, they may get them for another couple of years to be a permanent part of the organization. We see other states who are actually officially teaming up with the university systems, both 2-year and 4-year, to kind of provide those critical security services and people associated with that. You know, we're learning that, hey, maybe it is a world of certification and not a world of degree anymore. So that kind of that whole training and certification realm and 2-year realm is kind of, so it's not one of these, it's all of these things. But I also think the ongoing enablement and re-education of employees, or maybe repurposing of employees that government and education entities have, can also be a piece of the solution. If you look at our platform and our Advanced Technology Center, WWT.com, we have thousands of videos and labs and things out there that we actually have customers leveraging as development tools, many of those with our good partner Cisco here on how-tos and kind of real-world proof of concept. So we're finding the platform being leveraged more and more as well as part of that workforce development plan.
Well, thank you very much, Sean. I tell you what, we are not lacking passion in this room. And so I want to thank you both. And I'm a member of Worldwide as well. So I know that what we're doing is making a difference, and our friends at Cisco are helping us to make a new world happen. So for more content like this, please visit WWT.com.